you have heard this man sing, if you have ever seen a film or a commercial about the 1960s, about Woodstock, hippies, the summer of love, you have almost certainly heard his high, strange, unforgettable voice float over the images. Going up the country, baby, don't you want to go? That voice belongs to a man almost no one can name. His name was Alan Wilson. They called him Blind Owl. He founded Canned Heat, wrote their biggest songs, and sang them in a voice like nothing else in rock. A fragile, keening falsetto that sounded like it came from another century. John Lee Hooker, one of the greatest blues musicians who ever lived, called Alan Wilson the finest harmonica player he had ever heard. Not one of the finest, the finest. Wilson played at Woodstock. He played at Monterey. His band's songs became the unofficial anthems of an entire generation's most famous festival. He was, quietly, one of the most gifted musicians of the 1960s. And on September 3rd, 1970, he was found dead behind a bandmate's house in a sleeping bag on a hillside at the age of 27. He died 2 weeks before Jimi Hendrix, 4 weeks before Janis Joplin. All three were 27. All three are part of what people now call the 27 Club. But two of them became immortal legends, and the third was almost completely forgotten. If you believe he deserves to be remembered too, take a second and hit the like button now. That's the whole reason this channel exists. Because Alan Wilson was not just a great musician, he was one of the strangest, gentlest, and most tragic figures the 1960s produced. A nearly blind, painfully shy genius who cared more about redwood trees than fame. So who was the Blind Owl? And how did the man behind one of the most recognizable voices of the decade vanish so completely from its story? Alan Christie Wilson was born in Massachusetts in 1943. He was brilliant, a serious, bookish boy with a photographic memory and an obsessive mind. And he was very nearly blind. His eyesight was so poor that he moved through the world half hidden behind thick glasses, seeing almost nothing without them. He fell in love with the blues, not casually, but completely. He studied the old Delta recordings the way a scholar studies ancient texts, learning every note, every bend, every breath. By his early 20s, he knew more about pre-war blues than almost anyone alive. A friend, the guitarist John Fahey, gave him his nickname. On a trip, the forgetful Wilson left his glasses behind, and Fahey started calling him Blind Al, after old blind bluesmen like Blind Lemon Jefferson. With his round face and scholarly manner, it soon became Blind Owl. The name stuck for the rest of his life. His knowledge was so deep that he did something almost no white musician of his era could. He earned the respect of the blues masters themselves. He helped the legendary Son House, one of the founding fathers of Delta blues, relearn his own songs for a comeback after House had forgotten how to play them. Wilson taught a legend his own music back. In 1965, Wilson co-founded Canned Heat with a giant of a man named Bob Haidt. They were opposites. Haidt, a loud, larger-than-life frontman. Wilson quiet, withdrawn, almost invisible. But together they built a band on their shared, encyclopedic love of the blues. Wilson gave Canned Heat its genius. He was the arranger, the scholar, the one who understood the music at its deepest level. And when he stepped up to the microphone, out came that voice. A high, haunting falsetto that no one who heard it ever forgot. He wrote On the Road Again and Going Up the Country, the two songs that made Canned Heat famous around the world. Going Up the Country, with its lilting flute and Wilson's soaring vocal, became so tied to Woodstock that it is almost impossible to picture the festival without it. By the end of the 60s, Alan Wilson's voice was everywhere. But the man himself was disappearing, into his fears, into his sadness, and into the forests he loved more than the stage. Alan Wilson did not want to be a rock star. Fame frightened and exhausted him. He was extraordinarily shy, socially awkward, and happiest when he was completely alone. Some who knew him believe, looking back, that he may have been on the autism spectrum, that his intense focus and his difficulty with people were part of how his mind worked. What he loved was nature. Specifically, he loved trees. Alan Wilson was one of the first true environmentalists in rock music, decades ahead of his time. He was obsessed with the destruction of the American redwood forests, and it caused him real, deep grief. He wrote essays about ecology. He talked about the redwoods constantly. He wanted to use whatever money and fame canned heat brought him to save the ancient trees he loved. When the band was not touring, he often chose to sleep outside, under the open sky, rather than in a house. But underneath it all was a profound and worsening depression. Wilson struggled with a sadness that the people around him did not fully understand. In an era that had almost no language for mental health, he felt things intensely: the loss of the forests, his own loneliness, his difficulty connecting with other human beings. This part of his story matters as much as the music, and it's the part almost no one tells. If you want this channel to keep telling the full stories of these people, not just the hits, but the human beings, please subscribe. It genuinely keeps this work alive. In 1970, Wilson achieved a lifelong dream. Canned Heat recorded an album with John Lee Hooker himself. On those sessions, Hooker, famously hard to follow because he ignored normal song structure, marveled at how perfectly Wilson tracked him. He said Wilson must have been listening to his records his whole life. It should have been a triumph. But Wilson was slipping. He had already been hospitalized for depression. By some accounts, he had attempted to take his own life earlier that year. The gentlest man in the band was quietly running out of strength. And in September of 1970, on a hillside behind his bandmate's house, the story of the blind owl came to its quiet, heartbreaking end. Canned Heat was due to fly to Europe for a tour. Alan Wilson did not show up at the airport. The day before, he had gone, as he so often did, to a hillside behind Bob Hite's home in Topanga Canyon, a place covered in trees and brush, where he liked to sleep outdoors, close to the nature he loved. On the morning of September 3rd, 1970, friends found him there, in his sleeping bag. He had died in the night. He was 27 years old. The official cause was an accidental overdose of the barbiturates he took for his anxiety and depression. He left no note. There were pills still on him that he had not taken. To this day, no one knows for certain whether it was an accident or a decision. And out of respect for him, that uncertainty is where the story should stay. What is certain is the loss. One of the most naturally gifted musicians of his generation, a scholar who had earned the respect of the blues legends themselves, a gentle soul who wanted to save the forests, gone alone on a quiet hillside at 27. And then the timing did something cruel to his memory. 2 weeks later, Jimi Hendrix died. 4 weeks after that, Janis Joplin. Two enormous, iconic stars gone at the same age, in the same season. Their deaths became defining cultural events. Alan Wilson's death was swallowed by theirs. He had gone first, but Hendrix and Joplin were the household names, the faces on the posters. The shy man who wrote "Going Up the Country" became a footnote in a story about other people. His ashes were scattered in a place that would have meant everything to him, among the great trees of a national forest. The man who loved the redwoods more than fame was returned to them. So what do we owe a man like this, whose voice we all know and whose name we forgot? Alan Wilson was an environmentalist before the word was common, mourning the forests decades before the world caught up to his grief. He was a blues scholar so devoted that he handed a legend back his own forgotten songs. He was a musician so gifted that John Lee Hooker called him the best. And he was a deeply fragile human being who felt the pain of the world too keenly and who did not survive it. All of that, the genius and the sorrow, lived inside the man behind that soaring, unmistakable voice. Listen to Going Up the Country Now, knowing who sang it. That high, yearning voice is a nearly blind, painfully shy young man dreaming of escape, of getting away from the noise and the crowds, of going somewhere clean and green where he could finally breathe. He got his wish in the end, in the saddest possible way. He rests among the trees now. Every generation rediscovers canned heat through a film, a documentary, a commercial. The voice keeps floating up over the images of Woodstock. And almost every time, no one watching knows they are hearing a ghost. The sound of a man who has been gone for over 50 years. So this is the correction. The voice of Woodstock had a name. He was a scholar, an environmentalist, a genius, and a gentle, suffering soul. He was Alan Wilson, the blind owl. He died first and was remembered least. Let that change here. This has been The File on Alan Wilson. If his story moved you, do the thing the world never did for him. Say his name in the comments, like the video, and subscribe. Thank you for hearing them.